When I was in the 10th grade, I had 2 A's. Oftentimes, I don't know how I got it, but I did not cheat. I had an A in Spanish and I had an A in history. One afternoon in that history class, I overheard one of my classmates talking about college prep classes. And even though now I know the name college prep says everything, but in the 10th grade, I didn't know what college prep classes were for. So after class, I caught up with that young lady and I began to ask her all about college prep. Tell me more about this. And she took the time and she began to talk to me, and as she explained that to me, I began to really get excited for 2 reasons. The first reason, I was talking to a girl. Of course, and for me that didn't happen very often. I had a big head. But the second reason I got excited was because for the first time in my life, I thought maybe I could go to college. I thought maybe I could be the first person from our house that goes to college. I went home that night and I remember I was so excited I could hardly sleep. Next day I got up and I went to talk to my counselor. He needed to give me a recommendation that I needed to give to my teacher. So after class I went up to my teacher, Mrs. Ski. I said, Mrs. Ski, I was wondering if you would write me a recommendation for college prep history. There was a long pause before she looked at me and she says, I think college prep history would be too difficult. And besides, she said, I don't know if you're cut out for college. All of the excitement that I had built up the night before was gone. I remember thinking to myself, what were you thinking? You know you're not cut out for college. But I also remember thinking, why wouldn't she just give me a chance? I didn't think I would get an A in college prep history, but I knew that if I could work hard, I felt as though I could pass. I ended up walking out of her class, and I never asked about college prep classes ever again. As a teacher, I often, 3 years after the conversation with Mrs. Ski, I found myself standing in front of a judge with my hands shackled to my waist and my feet shackled together. And that judge sentenced me to 15 years in prison for armed robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. The day that afternoon when that prison door closed behind me for the first time, I can tell you that I will never forget that sound. I remember my knees getting weak and I collapsed to the floor and I just cried. And I remember hearing or thinking about some of the voices that I had heard as a kid, like your student. I remember hearing some of the voices of my family members who would tell me I was going to end up just like my father, who was a career criminal and died in prison. But I also remember thinking to myself, I need to survive. So I just went into survival mode because that's what I knew how to do. As many of the kids that are in our schools, they know how to survive. So that's what I did. I prepared myself to spend the rest of my life in prison. And what I mean by that is I began to get into fights. I began to break every rule that they had. And because of that, what happens is you end up in solitary confinement, a small cell that's maybe 6 by 8. And I believe my first year in prison, I was in solitary confinement 6 to 8 months of that first year. But what I remembered is there was a teacher there that I met shortly after I reported or that I was in prison. And he taught English, he taught math, he taught an anger management class. And that was the class he was trying to get me to attend. And I don't know what it was about me, but shortly after short conversation with me, that teacher would just begin to ask me questions. Anytime he would see me, he would just talk to me, and I believe he saw something in me that maybe that I didn't see myself. But anytime I was in solitary confinement, he would come down to my cell and he would open up that little door that they used to pass food through. He would look at me and he would say almost the same thing every time. He'd say, "What are you going to do when you get out?" He would say, "This is just a minor setback." But the last time I was in solitary confinement, he did something different. He came down, he actually came inside my cell. And he sat down next to me. He looked at me and he said, "Mr. Humphrey, you know prison doesn't have to be your life." He said, you know you can get out of here and you can do great things." And before he got up and walked away, he looked at me and he said, "I believe in you." If he had stayed there any longer, he would have seen tears running down my face, because that was the first time I had ever heard those words. When I think back to that conversation that he and I had, because when he said, "I believe in you," my life changed. And when I think about that conversation, I know that it wasn't those words. It couldn't have been just those words by themselves that changed my life. So when I thought back to what he did by asking questions, by spending time with me each and every time he saw me, I know that, or I realized he was creating a connection. And that's step number 2. If he had just walked in my first day in prison and looked at me and said, "Get up, you can do great things, I believe in you," nothing would have happened. Because I was very guarded, and I didn't trust him. But by asking questions, spending one-on-one time with me, he proved to me that he cared about me. He didn't see me for the crime I had committed. He saw me for what I could become. So on that day, when he said, "I believe in you, you can get out of here and you can do great things," I believed him. And when he walked out of my cell, I began to repeat his words to myself over and over again. "Mr. Lyles, believe in me. You can do great things with your life." And what happened was, his words eventually became my words, and I began to believe in myself. I wrote down, or I sat down and I wrote what I call my success principles. And under his advice, I wrote down what I thought I could do to not just get out of it,